I'm going to try to keep this quick here, a little coverage of Reconstruction, an overview and summary, and hopefully an emphasis on contextualization. Just a few key points. First of all, genuine peace is essential if the Union is going to last at all. Also, there's three phases of Reconstruction you should be familiar with. And Reconstruction ends abruptly with the election of Rutherford B Hayes in 1877. Reconstruction is not necessarily complete, it just sort of ends. Reconstruction is going to have to fix several problems. Here are five to look at. First of all, law and order must be restored. We also need to restore trade and prosperity to the nation as a whole, but also to the South as a region of the country. We're not going to call them sections anymore. We need to renovate the labor system, as slavery is off the table, of course. And then there's a physical rebuilding that must occur, as well as sort of the social structure of the South that needs to be renovated. The country faced a real dilemma, and that is that you had to remove slavery once and for all, but you had to establish this genuine peace. So any mandated racial equality in any form would produce anger, alienation, and resentment on behalf of the South. So the eventual solution will be rights for order. Free people can protect themselves with equal political rights. So the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which you absolutely must know, will free people in the South. It'll define and provide citizenship to the freed people, and then it allows them to vote. As I said before, the election of Hayes and the removal of the military from the South will sort of turn Reconstruction over to the states. Uncle Sam is not in the South, therefore states are given the job of extending those rights of order to the freed people. Now, the freedmen are kept in a subordinate position economically with systems like sharecropping and tenant farming, was basically slavery by another name. Politically, their voting rights were restricted with literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses. And of course, there's this sort of social inferiority that's created through fear and intimidation by groups like the KKK and the White League. In terms of the phases of Reconstruction, there's presidential Reconstruction, first with Lincoln, continued by Andrew Johnson, shown there in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This is much more lenient, relatively speaking, than congressional, or what is also known as radical Reconstruction, which Congress took over and greatly reshaped the South in a northern image. And then the final phase of Reconstruction, this is after the election of Hayes and the removal of the military, this Redeemer phase, as Southerners take control once again of their local governments. Just a very brief look at these various phases. First of all, Lincoln's plan, the 10% plan you can see here. If 10% of voters took an oath, a loyalty oath, then statehood could be reestablished. So that's very easy for these southern states to re-enter the Union. And again, that was his goal, was to preserve the Union. Johnson's plan is largely a continuation of Lincoln's plan, although there was some stipulation that he could provide presidential pardons. Apparently, Johnson was sort of on the outside looking in of that Southern social circle. He's from North Carolina, but he didn't quite fit in, so I think some suggest this was a way for him to try to do that. But under his plan, states did have to adopt the 13th Amendment. This is something that the radicals had complained about regarding Lincoln's plan because that was not a part of his plan. But even still, even if slavery was abolished, those in Congress thought this was still too soft. And so Congress takes a much more stern approach to Reconstruction. They also passed legislation in the Civil Rights Act of 1865, which will lead to the 14th Amendment. You can see here that citizenship was defined and that discrimination was outlawed on the basis of race. But again, they're going to divide the South into 5 military districts, and so there's martial law in place as radical governments in the South are being established. Southerners who flip parties, the scallywags, as you know, or those who came from the North and moved to the South, the carpetbaggers, again, sort of bringing the Republican Party and Republicans to Southern governments. Here are those 5 military districts you can see here. Why did the radicals in Congress take this approach with Reconstruction? First of all, there's the idea of punishing the South for secession and jeopardizing the health of the country as a whole. Also, there's this idea of retaining Republican power and, in fact, spreading it. Remember, the Republican Party was a sectional party. It was the Midwest, and so here's an opportunity to spread those Republican ideals and bring them to the South. And part of that's going to be this extension of the protection for industrial growth through tariffs. Again, the South did not really like that, being largely agricultural. The Republican Party, by the way, will cling to those tariffs and support business from there on out. Also, there's a genuine, goal of aiding the freed slaves, and the Freedmen's Bureau is sort of the federal body that makes that happen. They had their greatest success in education, providing literacy to people who would now be voting in presidential and local elections. The final phase is the Redeemer phase, and please keep in mind that if the Civil War ended in 1865 and Reconstruction ended in 1877, well, that's a 12-year period, and Americans were beginning to be concerned with other things other than Reconstruction and the rights and concerns of the freedmen. And so many of the old abolitionists in the Republican Party were being replaced by liberal Republicans that basically just had different interests. Also, once the federal troops are removed from the South, the states in the South are left to, in fact, ensure and protect the rights of the freedmen, which we know did not necessarily happen. Republican governments that were created during radical Reconstruction were essentially dismantled, and Democrats retook their seats, and business went on much like it did before the Civil War. So the largest success of Reconstruction, of course, was the restoration of order, and that's done by removing slavery. You can see here the source of that disorder was inequality, and therefore the remedy for that disorder was equality. Now, while there's a lot of social unrest and injustice in the South after the Civil War, there's no more talk of secession. So in that regard, Reconstruction was a success. Here's an interesting question to kick around. Do you support the movement for independence in the 18th century, as in, huzzah, no taxation without representation? You probably do. Do you support the South's right to secede in 1861? Most people do not. And so, how can we justify independence but condemn secession? In fact, some describe this as a major dilemma in studying American history. Lincoln was fighting to preserve the Union. So was Lord North. Unfortunately, his coercive acts led to a little tea party in the Harbor. One way to resolve that dilemma is to say that the colonial push for independence, as well as the federal effort to preserve the Union during the Civil War, both were fighting to protect free institutions, and many people, including many of the founders and framers of the government, started to see that the federal government had a responsibility to protect the rights of individuals, whether it's the Bill of Rights in the constitutional ratification period, or now in freeing the slaves and ensuring legal protection of the law. Many people also consider the Civil War and Reconstruction as like the final phase of the American Revolution because it sort of answers the question that we've asked in class about 150,000 times of who's in charge. Don't forget, states' writers were seceding in 1861. They felt that they were protecting their own local interests that were being taken from them by a federal government that had perhaps lost its way. Well, the federal government asserted its authority in fighting the Civil War and reshaping the South throughout Reconstruction. I try to present this first portion of U.S. history as like phase one, the consolidation of political power. So go on back to the beginning of the school year, and we talked about 13 colonies that existed that eventually did win their independence from Great Britain. They're then united with a weak central government, and so you have some authority, some political power moving towards the center. Obviously, I'm talking about the Articles of Confederation, and for a variety of reasons, that was scrapped altogether and the Constitution was created. And of course, it's a much stronger central government. But there were challenges to that from the beginning, whether it was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, or the nullification crisis, again from South Carolina in the 1830s as a result of the Tariff of Abominations, and later secession in the goal of, again, protecting states' rights. Well, from Reconstruction and following Reconstruction, we have a new national state that is committed to citizenship and the rights of all. Now, again, that is done through this process of Reconstruction. Now, in 1988, historian Eric Foner wrote this book titled Reconstruction, and it's considered to be the source to go to for a general look at Reconstruction. It's very in-depth, as you can imagine. Here are 4 themes that he outlines in his introduction that are sort of the basis of the book. And number 1, he says that African Americans were very involved in the process of Reconstruction and the reshaping of the country. Number 2, Southern society is radically transformed. Obviously, slaves are now freed, and so that brings concerns and questions over the labor system and social structure, as well as political power. He also says that there is an evolution of racial attitudes and race relations, and despite racism, a significant number of Southern whites would link their future to African Americans. And finally, he points out that there was an emergence of a national state. And obviously, I spoke about this in the last slide, but he says this is the most controversial thing to come out of Reconstruction. And here you can see Foner describing why he felt this new national state was so controversial, so please pause the video and read that if you'd like. But also remember that we're moving into this gilded age after the Civil War, and we have a new national energy, a new federally directed, the nation's being directed by the federal government, we should say, and business and economics are often at the forefront at the expense of individuals. And with that came high taxes and corrupt politicians. And so that created even more animosity in the South towards the Republican Party. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or post them in the comments below, or you could just stop in the class. Take care.